Hey, what's happening, friends? Trumpeter and improviser Bobby Spellman here to welcome you to the first episode in our jazz improvisation series. In this series, I will be taking you through a number of very common chord progressions that make up many of the tunes in our standard jazz repertoire. Along the way, I'll be discussing different ways that you can navigate these chords in order to gain a better command of improvisation, as well as to find your own unique artistic improvisational voice. Now, before we dive into the various chord progressions that we'll be discussing, I thought it'd be useful to do an overview of the anatomy and structure of chords, as well as the 7 modes typically associated with the major scale. Now, some of this information may be familiar to you, but I'm hoping that I can give you a little bit of a new perspective on it that will provide a foundation for what we will later do, connecting these various chords together in order to be able to navigate some of our favorite jazz standards. So today we're going to dive into the anatomy of a chord and the various modes on this exciting episode of Theory with Bob. All right, gang, we're going to start at the very beginning today, and we're going to cover a lot of information, but it is sure to be a lot of fun. If you would like a chart that contains all of the information that we'll be talking about in this episode so that you can follow along, I will put a link in the description to a PDF covering all of the chords and modes that we're going to talk about in this episode. So without further ado, let's dive in. A chord is a sonic structure containing typically 3 or more notes. If we start out in the key of C major with the C major scale, we can create a simple C major triad by combining the first note of the scale with the third note of the scale and the 5th note of the scale. That is probably a sound that you are very familiar with, and it provides the foundation for all of Western music. Now, different styles of music typically have different kinds of chords. So if you're dealing with rock, pop, and folk music, it's common to have 3-note chords. However, in jazz, we usually add 4 notes to our chords. We usually have 4-note chords. So in this case, we can create what is called a C major 7 chord by adding the 7th note of the scale to our C major triad. That gives us this nice sound here. Now, if we move the whole thing up a whole step to the 2nd degree of C major, now we have D, F, A, and C gives us what is called a D minor 7 chord. That is the 2 chord in the key of C major. So, the C major 7 chord in the key of C is what we call the tonic. It's the root, it's the first chord of the key. Moving up, that gives us a D minor 7 chord, the 2nd chord in the key. One thing that you will notice is that, typically speaking, when we label chords in their relationship to the key, we will often do so using Roman numerals. A major chord will be written with a uppercase Roman numeral, and a minor chord will be written with a lowercase Roman numeral. So throughout these videos, as you see these Roman numerals, that's what we're dealing with here. It's all of these chords and their relationship to the key or the key of the moment when we're dealing with a shorter chord progression. All right, so in this case, let's go back to D minor 7. The quality of this chord is the sound of the chord in relation to the root note. So in this case, the root note is C. In this case, the root note is going to be D on a D minor 7 chord. So, because the 3rd is a minor 3rd in relationship to the root, that gives us a minor chord. The only thing that determines major versus minor is the quality of the 3rd. Now, in order for this to be a major 3rd, we'd have to move that up to an F sharp. That would give us this sound, but that F sharp is outside of the key of C major, so we're moving down to F again, and now we have a D minor chord. Similarly, once we add the 7 on there, that is a minor 7th because it's minor in relation to the D root of the chord. But those 4 notes give us a D minor 7 chord. If we were to take that 7th note and move it up to a C sharp, the major 7th in relation to that root D, that gives us what's called a minor major 7 chord. It's a very different sound, and once again, we're using a note outside of the key of C, so we're going to move back down to the standard 2nd chord in C major, D minor. Now, here we have in the D chord, we have the 1, the minor third, the 5th, and the minor 7th. We can go up another third and add this note, which we call the 9th. Now, if you count up the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 is the octave. That's the D again in this case. If we move up one more note, that gives us the 9th. Now, what you will notice is that the 9th is the same as the 2nd, but it's up an octave. So typically speaking, when we're constructing chords, we're going to talk about the different notes beyond the minor and major 7 chords as being 9, 11, and 13 rather than 2, 4, and 6. But they mean the same thing, and depending on what kind of voicing you're using, you can voice those notes down in the lower register of the chord, whatever. But typically we speak of them in terms of 9, 11, and 13. So in this case, in a D minor 7 chord, the 9 is going to be E, the 11 is going to be G, and the 13 is going to be B. Now you can hear, in this case, all 7 of those notes work simultaneously to give us the sound of a D minor 9, 11, 13 chord. However, if we were to play each of these notes in seconds, in order, that gives us the second mode in C major, which is called the D Dorian mode. Now, D Dorian has a very specific sound to it. Each mode has its own characteristic sound, and as an improviser, if you can learn to use these various sounds, you can unlock many different emotional concepts, and you can really, let's say, tap into people's soul and their understanding of the world around them in music and have a lot of fun with it. So, I'm a big fan of modes, and I think you will be as well. If we go back, once again, to our original tonic chord, the 1 chord, C major 7, the mode that we would associate with that C major 7 in the key of C is the C major scale, also known as C Ionian. So the first mode in the key of C major is C Ionian, or C major. The second chord is going to be a D minor 7, which is associated with the D Dorian mode. That D Dorian mode really comes from stacking all these notes onto the D minor 7 chord. If we move up one more note in the C major scale and we construct a chord using the third note of the key as the root, that gives us an E minor 7 chord. Once again, what makes it an E minor 7 is that we have a minor third in relation to E rather than a major third in relation to E. And we have a minor 7th in relation to E rather than a major 7th in relation to E. So one thing that I'm going to talk about a lot as we go through these episodes is the importance of the 3rd and the 7th of the scale, or of the chord. The reason for that is that each root of each chord is going to give us the foundation of the chord, which sets up the relationships of all the other notes in the scale. However, it doesn't tell us anything about the quality of the chord. So the quality of the chord, which is the sound of the chord, is based on the difference between the minor third, which gives us a minor chord, versus the major third, which gives us a major chord, or the minor 7th, which gives us either a minor 7th or a dominant 7th, or a major 7th, which gives us either a major 7 chord or a minor major 7 chord. If that's all very confusing, stick with me. We're going to cover it in greater detail. I'm just flooding your mind with information right now so that we can provide a foundation for all of the other stuff that we're going to talk about in these videos. So this is all will make sense as we go. So here we have an E minor 7 chord, and when we start on E in the key of C, that gives us the 3rd mode, which is E Phrygian. We'll talk more about the value and the use and the sound of E Phrygian later on, but just know that that is the 3rd chord. You will also be able to see that in the PDF that I put in the description. All right, moving along to the 4th note of C major, we can construct an F major 7 chord. So far, this is the 2nd major chord that we've run into in the series of modes, and the scale that is associated with this F major 7 chord in the key of C is F Lydian. Now, F Lydian, if you were going to spell it out in thirds, gives us an F major 7 chord with a 9, a sharp 11, and the 13. So you'll remember from 14 seconds ago that the 11 is the same as the 4, but in this case, it's a sharp 4 in relation to the root. If it were a natural 4, if we just had our regular old perfect fourth on there, that would give us a B flat, but because B flat isn't in the key of C, we're going to stick with a B natural, which gives us this beautiful chord, an F major 7, 9, sharp 11, 13. This would typically be written on a chart as an F major 7, sharp 11 chord. Oftentimes the 13 and the 9 are sort of implied, or the piano player or guitar player or whoever may include them in the voicings freely. But just know that if you run into an F major 7, sharp 11 chord, 9 times out of 10, you'll be dealing with the F Lydian mode, for example. All right, let's move up one more. Now, starting on the 5th note, we get G, B, D, and F. Now, in the key of C, that is a G7 chord, also known as a G dominant 7th. The sound of the dominant 7th has to do with the fact that in relation to the root, we have a major 3rd, but a minor 7th. And that minor 7th plus the major 3rd gives us a little bit of dissonance in this chord, which provides a little bit of motion, which will get us back to the tonic 1 chord. So this G dominant 7th has a very special role in the various chords in C major, and we call it the dominant chord. Typically speaking, the 5 chord will resolve to the 1 chord. So G7 is very commonly going to resolve down a 5th to C major. So if I voice that a little bit differently just so that you can see it, one thing that you will notice is that the root will move down a 5th from G to C, and the 7th of G will resolve down to the 3rd of C, and the 3rd will either resolve up to the 1 of C or it will stay where it is. That gives you a sound that goes a little something like this. Now that's probably the most common chord progression in all of Western music since the 1700s, and that is a just the dominant, the 5 chord resolving once again so that you can hear it to the 1 of C major. That G gives us what is called the G mixolydian scale. G mixolydian is what you would typically play over a dominant 7th chord, especially when it is the 5 of the key at hand. So when you see dominant 7th, there are a lot of options that you might choose to use, but one of the most common is called mixolydian. It is the 5th mode of the major scale. All right, now let's move up one more. We're going to start on A now and get this A minor 7 chord. Once again, the reason it's minor is because the 3rd is minor and the 7th is minor. If you are talking about your minor scales, if you learned your minor scales back in the day, you are dealing with what is called the Aeolian mode. It is the 6th mode of the major modes. And it sounds like that. It is a little bit more common in classical music, for example, whereas in jazz, the Dorian mode is typically the more commonly used minor mode, but any of them may be used. You will notice this scale in particular. Actually, you can do a little contrast in scales. If you listen to the tune Milestones from Miles Davis's album Milestones from 1958, the first couple of bars, typically you're talking about the G Dorian mode, and then that moves up to an A Aeolian sound. So you can hear the difference between that if you check out that particular tune. So there you have your natural minor scale, also known as the Aeolian mode. Finally, we're going to move up one more note. Now we're up to the 7th note in C major, and we have what is called a B minor 7 flat 5 chord. Now, this is the only chord in the series of 7 major, 7 7th chords that are based on the major scale that incorporates a diminished 5th. So if you look at the structure of the scale starting on B, you get B, C, D, E, F natural, G, A, and B. That F natural creates an interval called a tritone, which is a diminished 5th, or in some cases an augmented 4th, but in this case we're talking about a diminished 5th. It's the only scale and the only mode that uses that diminished 5th in its structure. All right, so this is a particularly it's a characteristic sound of the B minor 7 flat 5 chord. A B minor 7 flat 5 chord is often called a B half diminished chord, but that can be a little bit confusing because of its relationship to diminished, so I often will call it a B minor 7 flat 5. Now, just to clarify, the difference between a B minor 7 flat 5 chord and a B diminished 7th chord is that in a B minor 7 flat 5 you have a minor 7th, and in a B diminished 7th you will have a diminished 7th, which is actually a double flat 7th. So you can hear this. This is a particularly this is a very specific sound, and that's to be distinguished from the B minor 7 flat 5. Now, 9 times out of 10 on a B minor 7 flat 5 chord, we will play the B Locrian mode. And that's just the C major scale, but starting on B and going to B. Now, as a quick aside, I think it's important to just specify that even though we're dealing with all of the 7 notes in C major, each of these chords and modes has a very distinctive individual sound, and they're not always related directly to C major. I'm starting with this because I think it's a good place to start with the C major scale and the key of C major so that you can see the relationship of all these modes. But bear in mind that even though they use all the same notes, the sound of a D Dorian scale is not the same as the sound of a C major scale. Even the chords have very different flavors because of the fact that you're dealing with a minor 3rd and a minor 7th versus a major 3rd and a major 7th. In all of these cases, as improvisers and composers, our job is to gradually learn the relationships of these various chord tones and scale tones to the underlying tonic of the key or the root of each individual chord. If you can understand the sound of the relationship between these various notes in these modes and chords, then you are able to use them to express yourself in any kind of musical context, but in this particular case, we're talking mostly about jazz music. Now, one more thing I'm going to add is when you have, for example, the 9 and the 13 of a chord, these notes are typically called extensions or tensions. So in jazz, it's very common, even on a major 7 chord, to incorporate the 9 or the 13 or many of the other notes that you have to deal with depending on the quality of the chord. All right, gang, so there you have it. A quick run through of the major scale and the several chords and modes that you can create using the 7 notes of the major scale. Obviously, if you were to move up a half step and do the whole thing in D flat major, it would work the same way, but instead of having C major and D minor 7 and E minor 7, you would have D flat major 7, E flat minor 7, F minor 7, and that would give you the D flat major scale, and then the E flat Dorian mode, and then the F Phrygian mode, etc. So once again, just to wrap up, you have Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian, and that brings us back to the 1 again, the tonic, C in this particular case. And if you get a handle on how those modes work and what their relationships are with these various scales and chords, then you will be able to improvise on any kind of jazz standard that you might run into. Of course, there are many variations on this, and we've only just started at the beginning. But as you go, we're going to expand this and cover the ways in which you can use these various modes and chords. All right, gang, I hope you had fun with that. If you like this video, give us a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. We're going to be doing quite a long series covering gradually all of these various shorter chord progressions that combine to make all of our favorite jazz standards. And I think you're going to have a lot of fun with it. So stick around for next week's episode, in which we will combine these various chords to make the most common chord progression in jazz music as a whole. All right, gang, if you are looking for lessons in jazz improvisation or brass, woodwinds, piano, guitar, etc., you can find us on our website at www.ridgewoodschoolofmusic.com or send us an email at ridgewoodschoolofmusic@gmail.com, and we'll set you up with a great teacher for what you're looking for. All right, gang, have a wonderful time practicing, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.